welcome to the Land and Everything Else podcast. This is our second interview with some of my favorite people. We've got Randy and Alex from Model Wealth. And if y'all could introduce yourselves in case somebody missed the rental episode, I'd love to meet you guys a little more.
I'll be a lot quicker this time around. So my name is Randy Bruns. I founded Model Wealth. We're Naperville, Illinois based, but we work with individuals all throughout the country. Some of our very best clients we've never even met. They get conducted through Zoom. And
yeah, my name is Alex Offerman. I'm a financial planner at Model Wealth, and at Model Wealth we specialize in flat fee, hourly based flat fee wealth management.
Hourly based project work and flat fee ongoing wealth management is two distinct differences.
So I wanted to talk to Randy and Alex, aside from being friends of mine for a long time. I wanted to talk about alternative investments through the lens of a different compensation model than a lot of our friends use who are listening in, right? You know, our two kind of popular compensation models right now in financial advising, we've got asset under management as a fairly popular compensation model. And we have fee-based, right, where we're going to get some commissions from products and we can also charge fees. That's dual registered 66 stuff. And so I would say an overwhelming majority of advisors are in those spaces. And I think that presents certain challenges in the alternative space. It's not on my platform. My custodian doesn't offer it. Compliance is uncomfortable with that. Whereas I think there is a freedom in how y'all do things in the world of alts. And so I really wanted to talk a little bit about that today, talk about some of the alt structures and things you see. And so I guess I'd open it up to you, Randy, and your story of starting Model Wealth. Like talk to me about that impetus of saying, I want something different.
I was at a large bank for one day shy of 10 years, and I kept being confronted with just massive conflicts of interest that I said, there's got to be a better way to do this. And ultimately, I made the decision to just break loose, and I wanted to charge relative to the amount of work that was required and not a fee based on somebody's level of wealth. So you get individuals with $3 million, for example, paying $30,000 a year. And then you get individuals who are maybe just getting started. They don't have any assets. They're loaded with college debt. They're trying to build up a savings account for emergency reserves. They want to build up a down payment for their first home. And those individuals are left out in the cold without a service model to address them. And it's all subsidized by individuals who more often than not have extremely simple financial situations and yet are paying $2,500 a month or $7,500 a quarter, if not more. So that's when I said, I got to break loose and just go do this, because I was really struggling to do the right thing in that bank environment. And it's not a knock against the bank environment, because I don't know if I would do things any differently. I want to act to every single client that walks in our door as if they're subject of a case study. And we have Alex here, Donovan, who is an actual instructor at the University of Illinois, and then Anna Thornburg. We just take on everything as a case study. And that's basically how we approach it. I'm rambling a little bit.
Yeah,
but it's fantastic. Yeah. Like, that's what we want to hear about.
Yeah,
that's my favorite part when Randy was talking about the case study. Whenever we meet with a new client, we always say, hey, if you're walking down the street in Chicago and someone from the University of Chicago pulls you over or pulls you out and said, hey, would you mind being the subject of a case study for the personal finance course where they rip apart your life and show you exactly where things are, making sure that you're on the right path from a health insurance to an investment to a property and casualty, all of the above. That's what we do. But unfortunately, you probably won't get picked as a case study at the University of Chicago. We will charge for our work, of course.
That's what we say. There'd be no conflicts in there of interest in that situation. We do have one conflict of interest, and that's just that we bill for our time.
Sure.
So,
and I mean, I think that's inevitable, though. Like altruism, I think to some extent, like we are all altruistic, but there's the point of liability, risk coverage, and the advice we're giving, and being prudent and fiduciaries. We have to get paid for that sort of things that we're doing and the knowledge and skill we have.
And one last thing on that is I always look at it, and I think we've said this to clients recently, where the second we are done with our project, we want to assume that it is going to be put on display on this podcast or whatever, shown to like the world's #1 financial planning experts, because we want it held to the highest academic standards.
I love that.
Yeah.
And I think that lends itself to an alternative investment conversation, right? And, we viewed alts through the lens of product and distribution on this podcast, and we viewed alts through the lens of, public versus private versus, what we're going to buy. But I wanted to kind of get into it with y'all is, we'll start with something we haven't really gotten into yet. Let's talk about art. Okay?
Yeah.
So you've got some clients, we were talking offline, with some significant art collections. And I guess I'd like you to share, what processes did you guys kind of create when you ran into that the first time, right? Because I think that's one of the magic pieces of financial planning and fiduciary work, is that I've become pretty certain that the word fiduciary and process go hand in hand, right? Do we have a process to address this challenge? So the first time you ran into something like art, let's talk about it. Was it a collector space? Was it an investment space? Was it just stuff on someone's wall they inherited? Like, let's walk through that conversation.
Well, we have an individual who, very modest means, she has a portfolio worth $300,000. She lives on Social Security, but she has art that's worth somewhere around $100,000. That's what she says she paid for it. So it could be worth way more than that. And so I always ask her, and I asked her today because I wanted to touch base with her just to make sure I had the numbers correct. I said, do you have anything on your insurance policy that insures all of that art? And she says, no, because I live on Social Security, and the last time I got a quote for it, it was too much than I could afford. And I'm going to call her after this podcast because it was on the train on the way here, and I thought, if you just took that $300,000 portfolio that she does not spend anything from, and she lives in a house that's worth $350,000. I can't imagine that the annual premium for insuring that $100,000 or whatever it's worth art is too hefty of a withdrawal from a $300,000 portfolio. What is hefty is if her house burns down and that $100,000 is gone.
Well, I would wager if you bought it for $100,000.
Yeah. It's got to be worth way more. Yeah. It's a very illiquid asset, obviously, because she doesn't have any desire to sell it. But and then we also say, well, who would you leave? Is that in your estate plan? Like, who inherits this? So yeah, but we've had, and we don't have to go into this, but we've had clients that have baseball card collections. Like, we have a client who also spoke to just yesterday and today, just because we're doing this podcast. So we have an individual who paid $7,000 for a 1952 Topps Jackie Robinson card in mint condition right before COVID. A few years later, a $7,000 card, a few years later, sells it for $160,000. And I said, what regrets do you have? Do you have any cards that you regret? He had a 1933 Babe Ruth card, and I want to say it was a PSA 7 or a PSA 8. And if you don't know cards, they get graded on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest quality. This was either a PSA 7 or a PSA 8. And he paid $2,500 for it in the mid-90s, sold it in the late 90s for $6,000. Today, though, he looks at that and says, that card is worth over $200,000 today. And I said, is that really, is that painful? He said, it is, but it's like if I shouldn't have sold Apple. But then I said, well, what cards do you love? He's got a Michael Jordan rookie card, the Fleer, which is the one I know. But then he also has one I didn't know, and this is debatably the real Michael Jordan rookie card. It's known as it was 1984 Star. It's the 101 card, and that's worth $40,000. The Fleer one's worth $16,000. But then he also has his favorite card is a 1934 Gaudi Lou Gehrig card that I don't even know. It's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yeah. He just says, I like it because it's just an attractive card.
So my question, and this may be for Alex, I guess, when you've got a client, and I don't imagine, they kind of come to you with this hobby or collection or property or, what it is they've got. You're not giving advice on what cards to buy, but what advice are you giving?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and that's a good piggyback off of what Randy was referencing here a moment ago. So the first client that he referenced, having about the $100,000 of artwork in their house, and she has about a $300,000 portfolio, you may think that off the top of your head, well, that's not it's 25% of their portfolio value. It's probably not a good idea to have 25% of your portfolio value in one singular asset class, not to mention it's an illiquid asset class that probably fluctuates quite a bit because you can't sell it. So it's only worth what the buyer would actually pay for it. So, but Randy also referenced in that discussion there that she's not living off her portfolio. She has the flexibility, the financial means to be able to go out and buy those various artwork or buy the various pieces. That is how we ultimately determine day one or step one. When someone walks in our door with this artwork, we say, okay, well, you have this. Are you going to ultimately need it in the future because of financial means, meaning that you need a withdrawal or needing to have cash flow producing assets at some point in time? If that answer is no, then we say, hey, great, let's make sure you have the right insurance coverage. Let's make sure it's in your correct estate planning documents, so on and so forth. But if that answer is yes, then there's a process that we determine saying, okay, well, you are likely going to need to sell this over the next 10 years. You have a 10-year time frame until we believe that your portfolio, based upon Monte Carlo simulations, things like that, that may need to ultimately start selling these assets. And at that moment in time, we can start having the liquidation plan or the liquidation setup of saying, hey, this is how much it's going to cost to go to a auction. This is how much it's going to cost to go here, and have those conversations proactively, not a reactive conversation with the client of saying, hey, or they come to us and now they have $100,000 in their portfolio and $200,000 of artwork. And they say, well, I never wanted to sell this. We would say, well, if you remember a few years back, we knew that this was coming. This was definitely on the horizon. And this is the discussion that we had. Here's how much it's going to cost. Your artwork appreciated, which is great, but here's the different tax liabilities and things like that that come about.
And to that end, and again, I keep asking you to put your professor hat on, but you're good at it. So to that end, Alex, what are we talking tax-wise? Do we get capital gains on this stuff, or what do we got?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it is long-term capital gains. I love to say when
some collectible rates
collectibles
too.
have a
Collectible
28%.
It's a 28% tax rate. I always like to say, if I don't know the answer, I will definitely say I don't know. And that was one of the answers I actually didn't know.
That's actually something that we preach. Like, you have to have a sense of humility in this profession. If you don't know the answer, just say, I don't know the answer,
and look it up,
I can look it up. Yeah.
And I think that's the important part, right? Is that's what I love about, your firm is processes, right? I don't imagine a financial advisor starts off and goes, well, I better learn baseball cards, right? Like, maybe when they were growing up, they had some tops, right?
Yeah.
But like that's grown up, and all of a sudden you've got someone with potentially $1 million in baseball cards, right? So that you've learned it, right? The next time someone with collectible assets comes in to that end, not necessarily baseball cards, but it could be another type of physical collectible, your firm's more prepared, their system, there's models in place.
Yeah.
Right. And I love that about what you do. And I can't tell you how important that is to that end. And so baseball cards and art, and what other kind of, we'll save land for the end. So let's hold off on land, but what other type of would you say non-stock and bond assets do y'all run into?
Does a quarry count as land?
That was going to be my next question.
It counts as a fascinating one. Let's get into it. Let's dig in.
We have an individual who 130 years ago, 2 Germans immigrated to Illinois, and they started a quarry. This quarry has been so successful that now, 130 years later, this client owns just a 2.2% stake in this quarry. It's got to stay in the family.
All right.
She, on her 2022 tax return, reported $122,300 and some dollars of K1 income from the quarry.
Okay.
And that income,
that's a 2% stake.
It's a 2.2 to 2.3%
I just did some math. We're good to go here.
It is. And
exactly.
And that income, and then so these are questions that we ask. We say, okay, has there been any research done by the quarry to know, like, how sustainable is this? And it'll produce rock for over 100 years. Wow. So this is a very stable quarry. It's a stable income, and this has helped her max out her 401k. She now makes backdoor Roth contributions.
Sure, of course.
Just all these sorts of things and it's just something that because of the stability of that income, and she'll get Social Security, she'll get a pension, or no, she won't get a pension because she elected the self-managed Illinois, whatever.
Yep.
But anyways, her finances are phenomenal.
Well, and then again, what I've just heard you say is, we look at this asset, we do research into the asset, we investigate the asset, right? We know the ownership strategy of the asset, we know rules surrounding the transfer of the asset, we know sort of the sustainability of the asset from that ESG standpoint. and we know a little bit about the family history of the asset, right?
Yep.
And so that project work kind of lent itself to that exploration.
Yep.
That I think again is a driver for the business model y'all offer, is that we can
Yeah.
say, okay, we can dive in here and we can use our collective firm energy, brain, and talent, bring in other people as we need, but that lets you dive into that.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, when we talk about alts, that's so critical, because alts from a personal level, personal holdings, require that to make any kind of recommendation down the road. That's not understanding it, you're going to miss something.
Yeah. Well, and one other thing about that Corey is they can sell their shares, but it has to be sold to another family member.
Okay.
And there's sort of this unwritten agreement that nobody tells their kids how much income it is, because this woman didn't have a clue. She knew it was out there, but she didn't have a clue just how much it was. And she's not telling her daughter either, because I mean, there can be this like tendency to say, well, maybe I shouldn't work as hard as at my career if I'm getting an inflation adjusted $120,000.
Well, I mean, I think, but at the same time, let's look at like, you know, poor King Charles, and like he's going to come into his in his 70s,
Exactly.
right? So like,
well, that's true. Yeah.
You never know, like
Yeah.
when you're going to get that stream.
And I'll piggyback off of that. There was a comment that we had from her, and this is just in general with these properties, because she doesn't see a value of it. She only sees the value that's ultimately getting generated on a yearly basis in cash flow. She doesn't understand how much that actually is worth.
That a capitalized financial asset.
Capitalized, yes, exactly. So we'll run a cash flow model or a discounted cash flow model and say, hey, this is how much this would be worth in today. If you had this lump sum and you're going to get produced, let's say $100,000 a year, this is how much that value is at this moment in time. Your net worth is significantly higher than what you believe it is because of these cash flows that are coming in the future that you don't see.
Well,
you think of that as Social Security and any other assets.
And there could be, I mean, to some end, I don't know if you're at a state tax level there, but you could get there.
Absolutely.
Right? Like with a cap rate and that kind of thing, you could suddenly find this quarry like kicking an estate tax off one day. Probably not for this situation, but somewhere.
No, 100% though.
So I think that's again the dive down into that, and then recommendations and conversations around generational wealth, and do I want to give it to the kids, and what if I have multiple kids, and then divide up the interest. At some point it gets so tiny it's not worth having, but it's definitely not there right now.
Yeah.
Right. Like my sister and I will inherit when my father goes 1/64th each of some oil rights in West Texas that my dad gets somewhere around $200 a quarter on. So there's a point where right, but we're still there, and I cannot wait to be the oil baron and his mother before him. And you can go back where it was worth something, but now it's just like this delineated. So let's kind of cover. I know we talked about another kind of alternative investing element. Land, and the title of the podcast is Land and Everything Else, and we are from the College of Ag and environmental consumer economics, or sciences, sorry. But I think one of the things with land is the value is very introspective of if you farm it or not, if you live on it or not. And you were telling me an example of somebody that inherited some wealth, and just like their perspective, your perspective, I'd love to enter into that. When somebody comes and says, oh, I suddenly have acreage, what do you all go through with that?
So up until a few years ago, we never really dealt with farmland, but all of a sudden in the last 2 years, there's probably been 5 to 10 individuals who either they inherit the land and they're getting a rental income from it, or they inherit it, it gets sold, and then we have a couple that has their prior nest egg was $1 million. They inherit farmland, now it's $6 million. So you get that,
Dang.
Wow, it's $1 million, now it's $6 million, and that's a whole other can of worms.
Acreage values are crazy.
Yeah, exactly. But we do have an individual who, and you'll know who it is, Alex, when I mention this. The land they believe is worth about $500,000. It produces like $12,000 a year of income, which, I mean, you can do the math on that. That's not a great yield. So, but ultimately they want to sell it. And I believe it's the wife owns it with her 2 brothers, and they're older. So they're going to go first, most likely. And they'd rather sell it to her brothers than deal with their nieces and nephews.
Yeah.
So, okay. So that's what they're looking at. And we say, well, shoot, 500, I've seen it's not difficult to generate $12,000 a year from stock and bond markets on a $500,000 investment. But I've also seen $500,000 farmland where you just see like unheard of income produced by it.
Well, and we have been in an environment of unheard of appreciation, right? In farmland, specifically in, you know, kind of Midwest corn and beans. And we've seen crazy appreciation of acreage.
Yeah.
So, you know, is that going to continue or not? I don't know. But I think the point I'm trying to drive here is that perspective matters, right? To this person who is not a farmer, and from what I would gather, didn't farm growing up.
No.
This is a $500,000 asset with a relatively low yield in a difficult family situation ahead.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm out.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I think that's a different perspective than some of the other podcasts where we've talked about where somebody was farming growing up and grew up knowing everything they need to know, that their return is going to be higher than 12,000 because it's not a cash rent and it's not necessarily an impetus to them to keep it in the family, right? It's not this is where we had Thanksgiving situation.
Yeah.
Right. So I just kind of wanted to hit on that perspective really matters when we talk about land and alts, I think quite a bit. So, you know, I like to always ask on land and everything else a question of all of our guests. I'd like to ask both of you this question. And the question is, if you're advising a young financial advisor and they are interested in learning more about alts, using alts with their clients, and when I say alts in this context, it's non-stock and bond investing, right? So non-mutual fund, non-stock and bond. That's my definition. Where do they start this journey? What advice would you give them, Alex?
The one thing that's helped me is just be curious from the tax return, looking at the tax return and saying, okay, well, where did this income come from? How was it generated? Okay, let's track it back. Okay, how does that ultimately operate? And then go from there. But from an individual standpoint of saying, okay, well, I just want to learn about non-stock or bond related assets. Where do I go? And you can get designations to help pursue that. The CAIA, or the Chartered Alternative Investment Analyst designation, will help with that as well. But always be curious. And that's where I have found, and with clients, as we were just alluding to over here over the last 20 or so minutes, these were items or situations that we weren't normally accustomed to. We didn't see these often. And it's something that we took enjoyment out of, to be able to figure out how this operated, how it works, how the inner workings are. If they are upon the death of the spouse, or upon the death, it automatically gets sold, because then the kids don't want to worry about it anymore. They just take that out of their hands, that, hey, you're selling this land upon my death, and that's it. We're not going to have any arguments about who's going to have it, who's going to own it, and things like that. That is really helped us on our side of things. But I would say research designations, or just be curious in the situations that come about.
And I would say, first of all, nobody's ever not been able to retire because they didn't own a rental property or artwork or something. But they have been unable to retire because they've left everything in a savings account, for example, or not retire to the quality of life that they dreamed of. So stocks and bonds, traditional non-alternative investments, do just fine. But I would agree with Alex. Just be curious, and don't be afraid to say, I have never worked with anybody in that. I've never worked with farmland or whatever, but I'm willing to learn it. And but also, we say this all the time, like, if it's not in our wheelhouse, we will much rather send it to somebody who it is, because we don't want to get embarrassed in front of a client.
You know, you are prudent fiduciaries. You're not going to give advice in an area you're not equipped to.
Yeah.
Right.
But I will say, like, if we get a specific situation, we'll beat it senseless to where we understand it, like the insides and outs. And what's great about that is you're now an expert to the very next person that comes in with that or a similar situation. And Alex is the one who I always describe Alex as, like, if he doesn't understand something, he will go home and read the prospectus or whatever, go on the internet machine, and he'll know it as well as the person or firm that drew it up in the first place. And so that's just a talent Alex has.
Thank you for that. It's a good talent. I'm just curious, and I think it's the general theme here. But I will piggyback and just say, we are very, and as Randy said, he alluded to, we will tell a client that this is not something that we are that we have come across in the past, and we can help you refer you out to someone or find someone that's going to be the best. But we made that very clear up front, so they understand that we aren't the best firm, or we've never seen that before. However, we would enjoy going through it and figuring out the answers and so on and so forth. But again, we have never seen that. So if we get into that project and we make a fool of ourselves because we didn't know it, we are very confident to come back to that individual and say, hey, we thought we would be able to get into this. Unfortunately, we were not the best firm, and here's the firm that's the best to do so.
And to put a bow on that, my answer would say, because Alex said be curious and learn as much as you want about it, but I would say be comfortable saying, no, I don't know that. And if it's something that's interesting to you, go out and learn it. There are so many resources to learn anything, but be comfortable saying, I don't really know that well enough.
I think that's fantastic advice. And I'd like to add on a little bit. Sometimes when we think of alts, and I think by nature of product offering, we think hundreds of millions, billions, like accredited investor, the mind goes to a lot of wealth.
Yeah.
And I wanted to just hit home our conversation today, and I hope everybody listening gets this out of it. Alts can also be very intimate. Yeah. They can be very personal. They can be very much in a family and a story and a history and community. And it's not necessarily always something that is big and huge and private equity and hedge fund. Alt can be the baseball card collection that suddenly I've got a card that could fund 2 years of my retirement. Yeah. It could be a piece of art on the wall that I got when I was 30 and now I'm 65 and I don't even know where to begin valuing that. Alts can be very personal and intimate. And I think that takeaway is something that we all can learn from. And I wanted to just kind of hit home on that as we tie up today.
Yeah, I would say we see that more often than not, that it is a more personal aspect rather than a big public or public offering or things like that. It is a lot more personal. Bank shares that the grandfather helped start the bank 60 years ago, 70 years ago. Now they've transitioned to 3 generations down. We see a lot more personal aspects from an alternative investing than they went out and bought the next best public offering or whatever that may be. Yeah.
And we have a family with a very famous chef who's also a client, and he owns a string of very, very popular restaurants, and I'm not going to say where because it'll give it away, but there are all sorts of risks to that. But man, do they pay out big time.
Well, and I would think again that sort of intimacy, and also just on the standpoint that understanding then working in that environment with that client is going to prepare you for the next time you run into somebody with a similar small business or someone in the restaurant business, right? Because now you can tie back and say, okay, well, this is the kind of metrics we'd be looking for.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, thank you all so much for a fantastic conversation, and I was so happy to have you guys.
Thank you.